The Story of Civilization, Volume 3, Caesar and Christ, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 2, Side 2. In 230, Rome took her first step toward the conquest of Greece by clearing the Adriatic of pirates and seizing a part of the Illyrian coast as a further protection for Italian trade. Safe now on south and east, she resolved to drive the Gauls over the Alps and make Italy a completely united state. To secure herself on the west, she signed a treaty with Hasdrubal, by which the Carthaginians in Spain agreed to stay south of the Ebro River, and at the same time she made an alliance with the semi-Greek towns of Saguntum and Amporius in Spain. In the following year, 225, a Gallic army of 50,000 foot and 20,000 horse swept down the peninsula. The inhabitants of the capital were so frightened that the Senate returned to the primitive custom of human sacrifice and buried 2 Gauls alive in the Forum as an appeasement of the gods. The legions met the invaders near Telamon, killed 40,000, took 10,000 prisoners, and marched on to subjugate all Cisalpine Gaul. In 3 years the task was completed. Protective colonies were established at Placentia and Cremona, and from the Alps to Sicily, Italy was won. It was an untimely victory. Had the Gauls been left unmolested for a few years more, they might have stopped Hannibal. But now all Gaul was aflame against Rome. Hannibal saw the opportunity he had longed for, to cross Gaul with little opposition and to invade Italy with Gallic tribes as his allies. The Punic leader was now 28 years old, at his prime in body and mind. In addition to a Carthaginian gentleman's schooling in the languages, literatures, and history of Phoenicia and Greece, he had received a soldier's training through 19 years in camp. He had disciplined his body to hardship, his appetite to moderation, his tongue to silence, his thought to objectivity. He could run or ride with the swiftest, hunt or fight with the bravest. He was the first to enter the battle, says the hostile Livy, and the last to abandon the field. The veterans loved him because in his commanding presence and piercing eyes they saw their old leader Hamilcar return to them in fresh youth. The recruits liked him because he wore no distinctive dress, never rested till he had provided for his army's needs, and shared with them all sufferings and gains. The Romans accused him of avarice, cruelty, and treachery, for he honored no scruples in seizing supplies for his troops, punished disloyalty severely, and laid many snares for his foes. Yet we find him often merciful, always chivalrous. Nothing occurs in the accounts of him, says the judicious Mommsen, which may not be justified under the circumstances and according to the international law of the times. The Romans could not readily forgive him for winning battles with his brains rather than with the lives of his men. The tricks he played upon them, the skill of his espionage, the subtlety of his strategy, the surprises of his tactics, were beyond their appreciation until Carthage was destroyed. In 219 BC, Roman agents organized in Saguntum a coup d'état that set up a government patriotically hostile to Carthage. When the Saguntines molested tribes friendly to him, Hannibal ordered them to desist. When they refused, he besieged the city. Rome protested to Carthage and threatened war. Carthage replied that since Saguntum was 100 miles south of the Ebro, Rome had no right to interfere, and had, by signing an alliance with it, violated her treaty with Hasdrubal. Hannibal persisted in the siege, and Rome took up arms again, never dreaming that this Second Punic War was to be the most terrible in her history. Hannibal spent 8 months in subduing the Saguntines. He did not dare advance toward Italy while leaving to the Romans so excellent a port for landing in his rear. In 218 he crossed the Ebro, challenging fate as Caesar would at the Rubicon. He had an army of 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry, none of them mercenaries, most of them Spaniards and Libyans. 3,000 Spaniards deserted when they learned that he planned to cross the Alps, and Hannibal released 7,000 others who protested against his enterprise as impossible. It was hard enough to force a passage through the Pyrenees. More unexpected was the fierce resistance of some Gallic tribes allied with Marseille. A summer of fighting was required to reach the Rhone, and a major battle to cross it. He had hardly left its banks when a Roman army arrived at the mouth of the river. Hannibal led his troops north toward Vienne and then struck eastward into the Alps. Celtic hordes had crossed those ranges before him, and he too might have done it without extraordinary hardship, had it not been for the hostility of the Alpine tribes, and the difficulty of getting his elephants through narrow or precipitous passages. Early in September, after a climb of 9 days, he reached the summit and found it covered with snow. There he let his men and animals rest for 2 days and then began the downward march through passes steeper than the ascent, over roads sometimes buried by landslides and often paved with ice. Many soldiers and beasts lost their footing and tumbled to their deaths. Hannibal spurred on his despairing forces by pointing out to them in the distant south the green fields and sparkling streams of Italy. That paradise, he promised them, would soon be theirs. After 17 days in the Alps, they reached the plain and rested. So many men and horses had been lost in the crossing that the army was now reduced to 26,000, less than half the force that had left New Carthage 4 months before. Had the Cisalpine Gauls resisted him as the Transalpine Gauls had done, Hannibal's progress might have ended there. But the Boii and other tribes welcomed him as a savior and joined him as allies, while the recently established Roman settlers fled southward across the Po. Faced with this second threat in 7 years to the very life of Rome, the Senate mobilized all its resources and called upon the states of Italy to unite in the defense of their land. With their help, Rome raised armies totaling 300,000 foot, 14,000 horse, and 456,000 reserves. One army, under the first of many famous Scipios, met Hannibal along the Ticino, a small river flowing into the Po at Pavia. Hannibal's Numidian cavalry put the Romans to flight, and Scipio, dangerously wounded, was saved by the brave interposition of the son, who was destined to meet Hannibal again at Zama 16 years later. At Lake Trasimene, Hannibal encountered another Roman army, 30,000 strong, led by the tribune Caius Flaminius, and accompanied by slave dealers bringing fetters and chains for the prospective prisoners whom they hoped to sell. With part of his forces, Hannibal decoyed this army into a plain surrounded by hills and woods that concealed most of his troops. At his signal, the hidden columns debouched upon the Romans from every side and killed nearly all of them, including Flaminius himself. This in 217. Hannibal now controlled all northern Italy, but he knew that he was still outnumbered 10-1 by a resolute foe. His only hope lay in persuading at least some of the Italian states to revolt against Rome. He released all prisoners whom he had taken from Rome's allies, saying that he had come not to fight Italy, but to set it free. He marched through flooded Etruria, where for 4 days no dry land could be found on which to pitch a camp, crossed the Apennines to the Adriatic, and there allowed his soldiers a long interval to refresh their energies and heal their wounds. He himself suffered from severe ophthalmia, took no time to treat it, and lost the use of one eye. Then he marched down the eastern coast, inviting the Italian tribes to join him. None did. On the contrary, every city closed its gates against him and prepared to fight. As he moved south, his Gallic allies, interested only in their northern homes, began to desert him. Plots against his life were so numerous that he had to assume ever-new disguises. He begged his government to send him supplies and men by some Adriatic port. It refused. He asked his younger brother Hasdrubal, whom he had left in Spain, to organize an army and cross Gaul and the Alps to join him, but the Romans had invaded Spain, and Hasdrubal did not dare to leave it. 10 years were to pass before his coming. Rome now adopted against her greatest adversary his own baffling policy of caution and attrition. Quintus Fabius Maximus, made dictator in 217, created an adjective by delaying as long as he could a direct engagement with Hannibal. In time, he believed, the invaders would be reduced by hunger, discord, and disease. After a year, this masterly inaction irritated the Roman populace. The assembly overruled the Senate, as well as all precedents and logic, by electing Minucius Rufus co-dictator with Fabius. Against Fabius's advice, Minucius advanced against the enemy, fell into a trap, was severely beaten, and thereafter understood why Hannibal said that he feared Fabius, who would not fight, more than Marcellus, who would. A year later, Fabius was deposed, and the Roman armies were entrusted to Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Caius Terentius Varro. Paulus, the aristocrat, counseled caution. Varro, of the plebs, was all for action. And as usual, caution lost the argument. Varro sought and found the Carthaginians at Cannae, in Apulia, some 10 miles from the Adriatic coast. The Romans had 80,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry. Hannibal had 19,000 veterans, 16,000 unreliable Gauls, 10,000 horse, and he had lured Varro to fight in a broad plain ideal for cavalry. He had placed the Gauls at his center, expecting that they would give way. They did, and when the Romans followed them into the pocket, the subtle Carthaginian, himself in the thick of the fray, ordered his veterans to close in upon the Roman flanks and bade his cavalry smash through the opposed horsemen to attack the legions from behind. The Roman army was surrounded, lost all chance of maneuvering, and was almost annihilated. 44,000 of them fell, including Paulus and 80 senators who had enlisted as soldiers. 10,000 escaped to Canusium. among them Varro and the Scipio who was to win the surname of Africanus Maior. This in 216. Hannibal lost 6,000 men, 2/3 of them Gauls. It was a supreme example of generalship, never bettered in history. It ended the days of Roman reliance upon infantry and set the lines of military tactics for 2,000 years. 5. Scipio. The disaster shattered Rome's hegemony in southern Italy. Samnites, Bruttians, Lucanians, Metapontum, Thurii, Crotona, Locri, and Capua joined Cisalpine Gaul in attaching themselves to Hannibal. Only Umbria, Latium, and Etruria remained firm. Hiero of Syracuse was loyal to the death, but his successors declared for Carthage. Philip V of Macedon, fearful of Roman expansion through Illyria into the east, allied himself with Hannibal and declared war upon Rome. Carthage herself became interested and sent Hannibal meager reinforcements and supplies. Some of the young Roman nobles among the survivors at Canusium thought the situation hopeless and meditated flight to Greece. But Scipio shamed them into courage. Rome was for a month hysterical with terror. Only a small garrison remained to protect it against Hannibal. Matrons of high family ran weeping to the temples and cleansed with their hair the statues of the gods. Some whose husbands and sons had fallen in battle cohabited with foreigners and slaves lest their strain should die. To regain the favor of obviously offended deities, the Senate again sanctioned human sacrifice and buried alive 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks. But the Romans, says Polybius, were most to be feared when they stood in real danger. Though they were now so overwhelmingly defeated and their military reputation had been destroyed, yet by the peculiar virtues of their constitution and by wise counsel, they not only recovered their supremacy in Italy, but in a few years made themselves masters of the world. The class war ceased, and all groups rushed to the rescue of the state. Taxes had already risen apparently beyond tolerance, but now the citizens, even widows and children, voluntarily brought their secret savings to the treasury. Every male who could bear arms was called to the colors, slaves were accepted in the levies and were promised freedom in the event of victory. Not a single soldier would consent to receive pay. Rome prepared to contest every inch of ground against the new lion of Carthage. But Hannibal did not come. His 40,000 men were too small a force, he thought, to besiege a city to whose defense many armies would converge from still loyal states. And if he took it, how could he hold it? His Italian allies, instead of strengthening, weakened him. Rome and her friends were raising forces to attack them, and without his help they would succumb. His aides reproached his caution, and one of them remarked sadly, "The gods have not given all their gifts to one man. You know how to win victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use it." Hannibal decided to wait till Carthage, Macedon, and Syracuse could unite with him in a multiple offensive that would retake Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and Illyria, and compel Rome to confine her power to Italy. He released all captives except Romans, and offered these to Rome for a small ransom. When the Senate refused this, he sent most of them to Carthage as slaves, and forced the rest, in Roman style, to amuse his men by gladiatorial combats, even to the death. He besieged and took several towns, and then led his army to winter in Capua. It was the most pleasant and dangerous place that he could have chosen, for this second city of Italy, some 12 miles north of Naples, had learned from the Etruscans and the Greeks the vices as well as the graces of civilization, and Hannibal's troops felt entitled to indulge for a season the flesh that had borne so many hardships and wounds. They were never again the invincible soldiers who had through many campaigns been formed in their master's Spartan image. In the next 5 years Hannibal led them to some minor successes, but while they were so engaged the Romans laid siege to Capua. Hannibal sought to relieve it by marching to within a few miles of Rome. The Romans raised 25 new legions, 200,000 men, and Hannibal, still limited to 40,000, retired to the south. In 211 Capua fell. Its leaders, who had let loose a massacre of Romans in the city, were beheaded or committed suicide, and the population which had strongly supported Hannibal was dispersed throughout Italy. A year before, Marcellus had taken Syracuse, and a year later Agrigentum yielded to Rome. Meanwhile, a Roman army under the 2 older Scipios had been sent to Spain to keep Hasdrubal occupied. They defeated him at the Ebro in 215, but both of them were soon afterward killed in battle, and their gains were being lost when their son and nephew, Scipio Africanus, was dispatched to the Spanish command. He was but 24, far below the legal age for so responsible a position. But the Senate was willing to stretch the Constitution to save the state, and the Assembly was by this time voluntarily subordinating itself to the Senate. The people admired him not only because he was handsome and eloquent, intelligent and brave, but pious, courteous, and just. It was his custom, before undertaking an enterprise, to commune with the gods in the temples on the capital, and after his victories to reward them with hecatombs. He believed, or represented himself to be a favorite of heaven. His successes spread the belief and filled his followers with confidence. He soon restored discipline among the troops, captured Nova Carthago after a long siege, and scrupulously turned over to the treasury the precious metal and stones that there fell into his hands. Most of the Spanish cities surrendered to him, and by 205 Spain had become a Roman province. Nevertheless, Hasdrubal's main force had escaped and now crossed Gaul and the Alps into Italy. The young leader's message to Hannibal was intercepted, and his plan of campaign was revealed to Rome. A Roman army met his modest force at the Metaurus River in 207 and defeated him despite his excellent generalship. Seeing the battle lost and all hope of reaching his brother gone, Hasdrubal leaped into the midst of the legions and took death in his stride. The Roman historians, perhaps romancing, tell us that the victor cut off the youth's head and sent it through Apulia to be cast over the ramparts into Hannibal's camp. Broken in spirit by the fate of a brother whom he had dearly loved, Hannibal withdrew his thinned-out forces to Bruttium. No action was fought with him this year, says Livy, nor did the Romans care to disturb him, so great was the reputation of his powers, even while his cause was everywhere round him crumbling into ruin. Carthage sent him 100 ships laden with men and food, but a gale drove the vessels to Sardinia, where a Roman fleet sank or captured 80 of them. The rest fled home. In 205, young Scipio, fresh from his victories in Spain, was chosen consul, raised a new army, and sailed for Africa. The Carthaginian government appealed to Hannibal to come to the help of the city that had so long refused to support him. How shall we imagine the feelings of the half-blind warrior, driven into a corner of Italy by an endless stream of enemies, seeing all his toil and hardships of 15 years brought to nothing, and all his triumphs summing up to futility and flight? Half of his troops refused to embark with him for Carthage. According to hostile historians, he had 20,000 of them killed for disobedience, and for fear that Rome might add them to her legions. Touching his native soil after an absence of 36 years, he hastily formed a new army and went out to face Scipio at Zama, 50 miles south of Carthage, this in 202. The two generals met in a courteous interview, found agreement impossible, and joined battle. For the first time in his life, Hannibal was defeated. The Carthaginians, mostly mercenaries, gave ground before the Roman infantry and the reckless cavalry of Massinissa, the Numidian king. 20,000 Carthaginians were left dead on the field. Hannibal, now 45, fought with the energy of youth, attacked Scipio in personal combat and wounded him, attacked Massinissa, reformed his disordered forces again and again, and led them in desperate countercharges. When all hope fled, he eluded capture, rode to Carthage, announced that he had lost not only a battle but the war, and advised the Senate to sue for peace. Scipio was generous. He allowed Carthage to retain her African empire, but demanded the surrender of all her war vessels except 10 triremes. She was not to make war outside of Africa or within it without Rome's consent, and she was to pay Rome 200 talents, or $720,000, every year for 50 years. Hannibal pronounced the terms just and persuaded his government to accept them. The Second Punic War changed the face of the western Mediterranean. It gave Spain and all its wealth to Rome, providing the funds for the Roman conquest of Greece. It reunited Italy under Rome's unquestioned mastery and threw open all routes and markets to Roman ships and goods. But it was the most costly of all ancient wars. It ravaged or injured half the farms of Italy, destroyed 400 towns, killed 300,000 men. Southern Italy has never quite recovered from it to this day. It weakened democracy by showing that a popular assembly cannot wisely choose generals or direct a war. It began the transformation of Roman life and morals by hurting agriculture and helping trade, by taking men from the countryside and teaching them the violence of battle and the promiscuity of the camp, by bringing the precious metals of Spain to finance new luxuries and imperialistic expansion, and by enabling Italy to live on the extorted wheat of Spain, Sicily, and Africa. It was a pivotal event for almost every phase of Roman history. To Carthage it was the beginning of the end. With much of its commerce and empire left to it, it might have solved the problems of regeneration. But the oligarchical government was so corrupt that it threw upon the lower classes the burden of raising the annual indemnity for Rome and embezzled part of it to boot. The popular party called upon Hannibal to come out of his retirement and save the nation. In 196 he was elected suffete. He shocked the oligarchs by proposing that the judges of the Court of 104 should be elected for 1 year and should be ineligible for a second term until after a year's interval. When the Senate rejected the measure, he brought it before the Assembly and carried it. By this law and this procedure, he established at one stroke a degree of democracy equal to Rome's. He punished and checked venality and pursued it to its source. He relieved the citizens of the extra taxes that had been laid upon them, and yet so managed the finances that by 188 Carthage was able to pay off the Roman indemnity in full. To get rid of him, the oligarchy secretly sent word to Rome that Hannibal was plotting to renew the war. Scipio used all his influence to protect his rival, but was overruled. The Senate accommodated the rich Carthaginians by demanding the surrender of Hannibal. The old warrior fled by night, rode 150 miles to Thapsus, and there took ship to Antioch, this in 195. He found Antiochus III hesitating between war and peace with Rome. He advised war and became one of the king's staff. When the Romans defeated Antiochus at Magnesia in 189, they made it a condition of peace that Hannibal should be turned over to them. He escaped first to Crete, then to Bithynia. The Romans hunted him out and surrounded his hiding place with soldiers. Hannibal preferred death to capture. "Let us," he said, "relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." He drank the poison that he carried with him and died, aged 67, in the year 184 BC. A few months later his conqueror and admirer, Scipio, followed him to peace. Chapter 4. Stoic Rome, 508 to 202 BC. What kind of human beings were these irresistible Romans? What institutions had formed them to such ruthless strength and character and policy? What homes and schools? What religion and moral code? How did they take from the soil, and by what economic organization and skill did they mold to their uses the wealth required to equip their growing cities and those ever-new armies that never knew rest? What were they like in their streets and shops, their temples and theaters, their science and philosophy, their old age and death? Unless we visualize, scene by scene, this Rome of the early Republic, we shall never understand that vast evolution of customs, morals, and ideas which produced in one age the Stoic Cato, in a later age the Epicurean Nero, and at last transformed the Roman Empire into the Roman Church. 1. The family. Birth itself was an adventure in Rome. If the child was deformed or female, the father was permitted by custom to expose it to death. Otherwise it was welcomed. For though the Romans even of this period practiced some measure of family limitation, they were eager to have sons. Rural life made children assets. Public opinion condemned childlessness, and religion promoted fertility by persuading the Roman that if he had left no son to tend his grave, his spirit would suffer endless misery. After 8 days the child was formally accepted into the family and the clan by a solemn ceremony at the domestic hearth. A clan, or gens, was a group of free-born families tracing themselves to a common ancestor, bearing his name, united in a common worship, and bound to mutual aid in peace and war. The male child was designated by an individual first name, or praenomen, such as Publius, Marcus, Caius, by his clan name, or nomen, such as Cornelius, Tullius, Julius, and by his family name, or cognomen, such as Scipio, Cicero, Caesar. Women were most often designated simply by the clan name, Cornelia, Tullia, Claudia, Julia. Since in classical days there were only some 15 first names for males, and these tended to be repeated confusingly in many generations of the same family, they were usually reduced to an initial, and a fourth or even a fifth name was added for distinctiveness. So P. Cornelius Scipio Africanus Major, the conqueror of Hannibal, was differentiated from P. Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus Africanus Minor, the destroyer of Carthage. The child found itself absorbed into the most basic and characteristic of Roman institutions, the patriarchal family. The power of the father was nearly absolute, as if the family had been organized as a unit of an army always at war. He alone of the family had any rights before the law in the early Republic. He alone could buy, hold, or sell property, or make contracts. Even his wife's dowry in this period belonged to him. If his wife was accused of a crime, she was committed to him for judgment and punishment. He could condemn her to death for infidelity or for stealing the keys to his wine. Over his children he had the power of life, death, and sale into slavery. All that the son acquired became legally his father's property, nor could he marry without his father's consent. A married daughter remained under her father's power unless he allowed her to marry cum manu, gave her into the hand or power of her husband. Over his slaves he had unlimited authority. These, and his wife and children, were mancipia to him, literally taken in hand. And no matter what their age or status, they remained in his power until he chose to emancipate them, to let them out of hand. These rights of the paterfamilias were checked to some degree by custom, public opinion, the clan council, and Praetorian law. Otherwise they lasted to his death, and could not be ended by his insanity or even by his own choice. Their effect was to cement the unity of the family as the basis of Roman morals and government, and to establish a discipline that hardened the Roman character into stoic strength. They were harsher in the letter than in practice. The most extreme of them were seldom used, the rest seldom abused. They did not bar a deep and natural pietas, or reverential affection between parents and children. The tum stili of Rome are as tender as those of Greece, or our own. Since the greater urgency of the male supplies woman with charms more potent than any law, her status in Rome must not be judged from her legal disabilities. She was not allowed to appear in court, even as a witness. Widowed, she could not claim any dower right in her husband's estate. He might, if he wished, leave her nothing. At every age of her life she was under the tutelage of a man, her father, her brother, her husband, her son, or a guardian, without whose consent she could not marry or dispose of property. On the other hand, she could inherit, though not beyond 100,000 sesterces, or $15,000, and she could own without limit. In many instances, as the earlier passed into the later republic, she became wealthy because her husband put his property in her name to escape bankruptcy obligations, damage suits, inheritance taxes, and other everlasting jeopardies. She played a role in religion as priestess. Nearly every priest had to have a wife and lost his office when she died. Within the home, or domus, she was honored mistress, mea domina, madam. She was not, like the Greek wife, confined to a gynoeceum, or woman's quarters. She took her meals with her mate, though she sat while he reclined. She did a minimum of servile work, for nearly every citizen had a slave. She might spin as a sign of gentility, but her chief economic function was to superintend the servants. She made it a point, however, to nurse her children herself. They rewarded her patient motherhood with profound love and respect, and her husband seldom allowed his legal mastery to cloud his devotion. The father and the mother, their house and land and property, their children, their married sons, their grandchildren by these sons, their daughters-in-law, their slaves and clients, all these constituted the Roman familia, not so much a family as a household, not a kinship group but an assembly of owned persons and things subject to the oldest male ascendant. It was within this miniature society, containing in itself the functions of family, church, school, industry, and government, that the Roman child grew up, in piety and obedience, to form the sturdy citizen of an invincible state. 2. The religion of Rome. 1. The gods. The Roman family was both an association of persons with things and an association of persons and things with gods. It was the center and source of religion, as well as of morals, economy, and the state. Every part of its property and every aspect of its existence were bound up in a solemn intimacy with the spiritual world. The child was taught, by the eloquent silence of example, that the undying fire in the hearth was the sign and substance of the goddess Vesta, the sacred flame that symbolized the life and continuity of the family, which therefore must never be extinguished, but must be tended with religious care, and fed with a portion of each meal. Over the hearth he saw the little icons, crowned with flowers, that represented the gods or spirits of the family, the lar that guarded its fields and buildings, its fortune and destiny, and the penates, or gods of the interior, who protected the accumulations of the family in its storerooms, cupboards, and barns. Hovering invisible but potent over the threshold was the god Janus, two-faced not as deceitful, but as watching all entry and exit at every door. The child's father, he learned, was the ward and embodiment of an inner genius, or generative power, which would not die with the body but must be nourished forever at the paternal grave. His mother was also the carrier of a deity and had likewise to be treated as divine. She had a Juno in her as the spirit of her capacity to bear, as the father enclosed a genius as the spirit of his power to beget. The child, too, had his genius, or Juno, as both his guardian angel and his soul, a godly kernel in the mortal husk. Everywhere about him, he heard with awe, were the watchful demones, or kindly shades, of those male forebears whose grim death masks hung on the household walls, warning him not to stray from the ways of his ancestors, and reminding him that the family was composed not merely of those few individuals that lived in his moment, but also of those that had once been, or would someday be, members of it in the flesh, and therefore formed part of it in its spiritual multitude and timeless unity. Other spirits came to his aid as he grew up. Cuba watched over his sleep, Abiona guided his first steps, Fabulina taught him to speak. When he left the house, he found himself again and everywhere in the presence of gods. The earth itself was a deity, sometimes Tellus or Terra Mater, Mother Earth, sometimes Mars as the very soil he trod, and its divine fertility, sometimes Bonadea, the good goddess who gave rich wombs to women and fields. On the farm there was a helping god for every task or spot, Pomona for orchards, Faunus for cattle, Pales for pasturage, Sterculus for manure heaps, Saturn for sowing, Ceres for crops, Fornax for baking corn in the oven, Vulcan for making the fire. Over the boundaries presided the great god Terminus, imaged and worshipped in the stones or trees that marked the limits of the farm. Other religions may have looked to the sky, and the Roman admitted that there too were gods, but his deepest piety and sincerest propitiations turned to the earth as the source and mother of his life, the home of his dead and the magic nurse of the sprouting seed. Every December the Lares of the soil were worshipped in the joyful feast of the crossroads, or Compitalia. Every January rich gifts sought the favor of Tellus for all planted things. Every May the priests of the Arval or plowing brotherhood led a chanting procession along the boundaries of adjoining farms, garlanded the stones with flowers, sprinkled them with the blood of sacrificial victims, and prayed to Mars, the earth, to bear generous fruit. So religion sanctified property, quieted disputes, ennobled the labor of the fields with poetry and drama, and strengthened body and soul with faith and hope. The Roman did not, like the Greek, think of his gods as having human form. He called them simply noumena, or spirits. Sometimes they were abstractions, like health, youth, memory, fortune, honor, hope, fear, virtue, chastity, concord, victory, or Rome. Some of them, like the Lemures or ghosts, were spirits of disease, hard to propitiate. Some were spirits of the season, like Maya, the soul of May. Others were water gods, like Neptune, or woodland sprites like Sylvanus, or the gods that dwelt in trees. Some lived in sacred animals, like the sacrificed horse or bull, or in the sacred geese that a playful piety preserved unharmed on the Capitol. Some were spirits of procreation. Tutumus supervised conception, Lucina protected menstruation and delivery. Priapus was a Greek god of fertility soon domiciled in Rome. Maidens and matrons, if we may believe the indignant St. Augustine, sat on the male member of his statue as a means of ensuring pregnancy. Scandalous figures of him adorned many a garden. Little phallic images of him were worn by simple persons to bring fertility or good luck, or to avert the evil eye. Never had a religion so many divinities. Varro reckoned them at 30,000, and Petronius complained that in some towns of Italy there were more gods than men. But Deus to the Roman meant saint as well as God. Under these basic concepts lurked a polymorphous mass of popular beliefs in animism, fetishism, totemism, magic, miracles, spells, superstitions, and taboos, most of them going back to the prehistoric inhabitants of Italy, and perhaps to Indo-European ancestors in their ancient Asiatic home. Many objects, places, or persons were sacred, sacer, and therefore taboo, not to be touched or profaned. For example, newborn children, menstruating women, condemned criminals. Hundreds of verbal formulas or mechanical contraptions were used to achieve natural ends by supernatural means. Amulets were well-nigh universal. Nearly every child wore a bulla, or golden talisman, suspended from his neck. Small images were hung upon doors or trees to ward off evil spirits. Charms or incantations were used to avert accidents, cure disease, bring rain, destroy a hostile army, wither an enemy's crops, or himself. "We are all afraid," said Pliny, "of being transfixed by curses and spells." Witches appear in Horace, Virgil, Tibullus, Lucian. They were believed to eat snakes, fly through the air at night, brew poisons from esoteric herbs, kill children, and raise the dead. All but a few skeptics seem to have believed in miracles and portents, in speaking or sweating statues, in gods descending from Olympus to fight for Rome, in lucky odd and unlucky even days, and in the presaging of the future by strange events. Livy's history must contain several hundred such portents, reported with philosophic gravity, and the elder Pliny's volumes so abound in portents and magic cures that they might well have been called supernatural history. The most serious business of commerce, government, or war could be deferred or ended by the priestly announcement of an unfavorable omen like abnormal entrails in a sacrificial victim or a roll of thunder in the sky. The state did what it could to check these excesses, called them indeed precisely that, superstitio. But it sedulously exploited the piety of the people to promote the stability of society and government. It adapted the rural divinities to urban life, built a national hearth for the goddess Vesta, and appointed a college of Vestal virgins to serve the city's sacred fire. Out of the gods of the family, the farm, and the village, it developed the de indigites, or native gods of the state, and arranged for these a solemn and picturesque worship in the name of all the citizens. Among these original national gods, Jupiter or Jove was the favorite, though not yet, like Zeus, their king. In the early centuries of Rome, he was still a half-impersonal force, the bright expanse of the sky, the light of the sun and the moon, a bolt of thunder, or, as Jupiter Pluvius, a shower of fertilizing rain. Even Virgil and Horace occasionally used Jove as a synonym for rain or sky. In time of drought, the richest ladies of Rome walked in barefoot procession up the Capitoline Hill to the temple of Jupiter Tonans, Jove the Thunderer, to pray for rain. Probably his name was a corruption of Diuspater or Diespater, father of the sky. Perhaps primitively one with him was Janus, originally Dianus. First the two-faced spirit of the cottage door, then of the city gate, then of any opening or beginning as of the day or year. The portals of his temple were open only in time of war, so that he might go forth with Rome's armies to overcome the gods of the foe. As old as Jupiter in the respect of the people was Mars, at first a god of tillage, then of war, then almost a symbol of Rome. Every tribe in Italy named a month after him. Of like hoary antiquity was Saturn, the national god of the new-sown seed, or Sata. Legend pictured him as a prehistoric king who had brought the tribes under one law, taught them agriculture, and established peace and communism in the Saturnia Regna, the golden age of Saturn's reign. Less powerful but more deeply loved than these were the goddesses of Rome. Juno Regina was the queen of heaven, the protective genius of womanhood, marriage, and maternity. Her month of June was recommended as the luckiest for weddings. Minerva was the goddess of wisdom, or mens, or memory, of handicrafts and guilds, of actors, musicians, and scribes. The Palladium, on which the safety of Rome was believed to depend, was an image of Pallas Minerva, fully armed, which Aeneas was said to have brought from Troy through love and war to Rome. Venus was the spirit of desire, mating, fertility. Sacred to her was April, the month of opening buds, or aperire. Poets like Lucretius and Ovid saw in her the amorous origin of all living things. Diana was the goddess of the moon, of women in childbirth, of the hunt, of the woods and their wild denizens, a tree spirit brought from Erycia, when that region of Latium came under Roman power. Near Erycia were the lake and grove of Nemi, and in that grove was a rich shrine of Diana, the resort of pilgrims who believed that the goddess had once mated there with Virbius, the first king of the woods. To ensure the fertility of Diana and the soil, the successors of Virbius, all priests and husbands of the huntress, were replaced each in turn by any vigorous slave who, having taken as a talisman a sprig of mistletoe, the golden bough, from the sacred oak tree of the grove, attacked and slew the king, a custom that endured till the 2nd century of our era. These, then, were the major gods of the official Roman worship. There were lesser but not less popular national deities. Hercules, god of joy and wine, who was not above gambling gaily for a courtesan with the sacristan of his temple. Mercury, the patron deity of merchants, orators, and thieves. Alps, goddess of wealth. Bellona, goddess of war. And countless more. As the city spread its rule, it brought in new divinities, the novenciles. Sometimes it imported the god of a beaten city into the Roman pantheon as a sign and surety of conquest, as when the Juno of Veii was led captive to Rome. Conversely, when the citizens of a community were moved to the capital, their gods were brought with them, lest the spiritual and moral roots of the new inhabitants should be too suddenly snapped short. So immigrants bring their gods to America today. The Romans did not question the existence of these foreign deities. Most of them believed that when they led the statue away, the god had to come with it. Many believed that the statue was the god. But some of the de novenciles were not conquered, but conquering. They seeped into Roman worship through commercial, military, and cultural contacts with Greek civilization, first in Campania, then in South Italy, then in Sicily, finally in Greece itself. There was something cold and impersonal in the gods of the state religion, They could be bribed by offerings or sacrifice, but they could seldom provide comfort or individual inspiration. By contrast, the gods of Greece seemed intimately human, full of adventure, humor, and poetry. The Roman populace welcomed them, built temples for them, and willingly learned their ritual. The official priesthood, glad to enlist these new policemen in the service of order and content, adopted the Greek gods into the divine family of Rome, and merged them, when possible, with their nearest analogues in the indigenous deities. As far back as 496 B.C. came Demeter and Dionysus, who were attached to Ceres and Liber, god of the grape. 12 years later, Castor and Pollux were received to become the protectors of Rome. In 431, a temple was raised to Apollo the healer in the hope that he might allay a plague. In 294, Aesculapius, the Greek god of medicine, was brought from Epidaurus to Rome in the form of a huge snake, and a temple hospital was built in his honor on an island in the Tiber. Cronus was accepted as substantially one with Saturn, Poseidon was identified with Neptune, Artemis with Diana, Hephaestus with Vulcan, Heracles with Hercules, Hades with Pluto, Hermes with Mercury. With the help of the poets, Jupiter was elevated into another Zeus, a stern witness and guardian of oaths, a bearded judge of morals, a custodian of laws, a god of gods. And slowly the educated Roman was prepared for the monotheistic creeds of Stoicism, Judaism, and Christianity. 2. The priests. To appease or enlist the aid of these gods, Italy employed an elaborate clergy. This book is continued on Cassette 3, Side 1.